I'll shortly introduce myself. As said, I'm Annelies Nillissen. We work on a lot of urban design, landscape design projects relating flood risk management, water management, climate adaptation. So it's a good time for us in that sense. A lot of national, international projects. And today I'll show a lot about the Rotterdam adaptation challenges because I understood that's what you're going to work on. And when we talk about Rotterdam, I'll tell a bit about the harbor. I don't know if you already had any field trips into the harbor, into the city. Well, you have the view, so that works as well. I'll talk about the urban climate adaptation strategies and also the strategies for the sustainable and climate-proof harbor. I'll start with a bit of an introduction of the area. And what we see is we're now here in the Rotterdam harbor area, is that over time the area was really developed from this natural delta into an area where the first occupation started, and we see it got more and more controlled and occupied until we're in the almost current situation. And this is what we see, of course, in a lot of deltas. And the Netherlands, of course, is famous for this control of the delta. Sometimes they joke that God created the world except for the Netherlands because it was created by the Dutch. So this control has always been in there, but now we're starting to see some side effects of it. If we look at the city, we're now in the city center. We see that the harbor in time, it moved out because the ships got bigger. This is also an international trend we see in a lot of cities. So it started as this inner city harbor, grew and grew, and the last part is really extended outward to host the biggest ships in the area. And if we look at the city, we're now somewhere here. We also see that these natural conditions are very defining in how the city developed. So the city started from the higher riverbanks. So here in the height map, we see the orange is the highest area. And in time, it further and further developed into the more swampy lower areas. With the increase of techniques, that became possible. And we see that here the blue swampy area is now also being occupied. So you see that really well in the map with the age of the buildings. We see that the more red, the older the buildings. I see that here in the front you guys are having a lot of other discussions to talk about, but let's so we see that the red areas are quite old. What we see in Rotterdam is that, of course, because of the war and the bombing, we have a newer city center that is rebuilt after the bombings in the war. And here we see that relation in the more swampier areas where they started developing later in time with the new techniques they have. And that explains also a lot of the climate adaptation challenges there are. So what we see is that there's always this balance between the water system and the land use. And in the Netherlands, we're really masters at controlling that water system, controlling our soil system to facilitate certain types of land use. What we see now with climate change is that this water system kind of gets into extremes. And because of that, we see a lot of impact on land use. And if you look at our strategy to deal with that in the Netherlands, we see that for a long time, it was really focused on strengthening this technical system. So on reducing the flood risk, for instance, by creating more levees, by supplying extra water in areas where there's a shortage of water, discharging the rainwater where you don't want to have it in the urban areas, and purifying the water if it doesn't have the right quality. And we now see that this system gets so extensive that we can basically not afford it anymore. It's a quite expensive, elaborate system. And we see more trends going towards being really robust. So having this robust system, creating more room for the river, but also buffering a lot of water, storing water in the cities, and natural purification. and even changing the land use. So having flood-proof buildings, adapting the types of crops. So we already see we have some forests in our country where they're changing from needle trees to trees with leaves because they use less water. And also adapting the agriculture, and that is quite a big debate currently in our country. If you could read the magazines here, the newspapers, it's a lot about changes that are necessary in agriculture but get a lot of opposition. This is not just Rotterdam that has that. If we look at delta areas worldwide, we see that in most delta areas where cities originated at these transition areas from the rivers towards the sea, because they were very favorable harbor locations with this fresh water supply. So we worldwide see the same challenges in the most densified areas. So that is a big global challenge as well. And what we also see is that it's never just climate adaptation. It's always a combination of different challenges, different transitions. So next to these climate challenges, we see a lot of social challenges. We see challenges with kind of preserving cultural heritage, food production, and of course circular economy. Energy transitions are now very big challenges. A question we got asked a lot is this climate change, it will come later on. Why do we need to adapt to that now already? For instance, with sea level rise, we see there's a period of about 70 to 100 years where it becomes relevant. With rainfall events, we see that these more and more extreme rainfall events will be there in about 50 years. And in the development, we see that developers work with theoretical lifespans of investments. So they say every building we build just has this economical lifespan of 30 years. So we don't have to take anything into consideration that is on the scope beyond 2050. Because then the economical value of the building has gone, you demolish it, you build a new one. In reality, of course, that's not what happens. No person says, my building is 30 years old, let's demolish it, let's get a new one, and then update it. So we really see that gap between the thinking of developers and the reality, where a lot of buildings you'll see in Rotterdam are really about 100 years old. So you can see that in the map I included with the ages of the buildings. There are a lot of 100-year-old neighborhoods, and these also have the biggest challenges. And also what we will build now will still be there probably in 100 years. I will go over the challenges that are here in this area. This is a cutout of the province with the city all the time in the middle of it. And this is a map of the subsidence. I think that's something that not everyone will be familiar with, but we have it quite severely here. And what subsidence is that we have a lot of peat soils. That's very typical for delta areas. And it's a very wet soil. And what is usually done is that the water level is lowered to make sure we have land for farming, especially for cattle to graze on. But if you lower the water, the ground compacts. And that is actually quite severely. So we see here areas where they expect the ground to compact like really meters. And that means that buildings that are built on it, they also compact. So when you walk through the city, you'll sometimes see strange street designs where all of a sudden in the pavement it goes up 30 centimeters towards the houses. And these are corrections for these subsidence levels. And you'll also see that, for instance, the big park that is close to here, it's much, much lower. And that is because there they didn't compensate because it's a park, it's not an issue. So we have a lot of compacting grounds and subsiding grounds. You can also see that in the buildings, and we see it in the agriculture areas, where we see that while the land subsides, the water gets much closer to it. And this also means, when we look at climate adaptation, a lot of people are talking about infiltrating water into the ground. So also in Rotterdam, a lot of actions are taken to take out the pavement and make sure you have a lot of green. But this is the amount of water that will fit in. It's a touchscreen, that's nice. But you see that actually the amount of water you can store is quite limited. So that'll come back later, but if you want to actually have water going into the ground, you see that what designers do is they kind of randomly design streets with a lot of green spaces, but if this is underneath it, the water will not go in, so it will be no use. You can build differently, so lighter building materials help. Composites or wood building is something that is explored a lot. But we also see that there are some areas that are really in trouble. So here we see a lot of areas where houses are built without foundation poles, and that means they really subside in time. Because the streets are heightened every time, we see that these houses are, for instance, 1 meter or 2 meters lower than the street. And these are interesting redevelopment areas. So they're now saying, okay, we need to intervene and improve these houses, and the only thing you can do is demolish and redevelop. Then we have water. We already have a lot of water here, but we see that with the extreme rainfall events, we get more and more water, and our discharge system cannot cope with it anymore. So these are quite typical situations where we see that the parks get quite wet, the streets get quite wet, and a lot of buildings, especially the basements, get wet. So there's really a lot of water getting into buildings, into the public space, and this becomes more and more frequent. And we already see a lot of interventions that are taken, such as blue roofs, gathering it in the public space in streets. So that's a very good development. But of course it has to be a bit more targeted. So I think in climate adaptation, we're now making that step where I think every designer that designs street profiles or public spaces has a bit of green in it, has a bit of blue in it, and addresses it as this is a climate adaptive design. We now see that it really goes into quantification. Here we see an example in Rotterdam of a public space that can also store quite a bit of water. And here we see these areas in the cities where you can actually infiltrate, and the areas where you cannot infiltrate, and we'll have to think of different solutions. So the blue areas are the areas where collecting the water in the public space will be of less use. And that's why it's also really important to work in these multidisciplinary teams. So to sit together with engineers or really have the data before you make the design. And the city of Rotterdam developed a lot of climate challenge maps. And these are maps that for a neighborhood show the amount of water that will be on the public terrain. And that should be stored in designs. And we see that in some areas it's quite a lot. And if you make water storage, of course the water also should be able to get there. Otherwise you need to pump it. So this makes these design challenges much more targeted. And we also see that there's some main roads that have quite a lot of surface. And in red we see the buildings that suffer from the damage. And if you look at it and start to calculate it, you see that if you really want to address this rainwater challenge, you get much bigger surfaces that you would need to store the water than just have a bit of water in the street. So this is a collage we made of Hamburg, where you kind of see the volumes that would be needed in a bigger city to effectively store water. So that's quite substantial. Of course, there are also a lot of opportunities for that. This is also an example for Amsterdam. One of the other challenges is the heat. The cities are really heating up and also remain heated. We had some hot summers, and in the climate change scenarios, we will see that this heat will really increase the amount of hot days. And we're hardly preparing for that. And since a lot of houses are, we already saw that with the energy crisis we just had with the high energy prices, there are a lot of especially poorer people living in private rented houses, and these developers will not make sure that these houses are well isolated, have good heat mitigation measures. So there you see that the public domain becomes very important in offering that space for the city. And this is an example in Amsterdam where we're trying to combine the water storage area that is needed with a new forest, so that you have really this cool space that can also store the water. It can also well be combined, for instance, with solar panels. We also have a big energy transition challenge, and there are maps that indicate like how much energy should you and how much surface should you have for sustainable energy, such as windmills or solar panels. And you can of course combine it, we just saw the collage with the urban housing, but especially with rural housing. Though we see now that in the Netherlands the focus is much more on densification within the existing city areas than it is on developing new areas outside the urban boundaries. There are also other transitions, and what we see in general is that for every target, whether it's improving the spatial quality or whether it's climate adaptation, that it's difficult to find budgets for it, to allocate to it. So if you're designing in the city, there's really this strategy that needs to be behind it in how do you connect it to other transitions. So one of the important transitions you see is, for instance, the mobility. And here we see the main road and the amount of capacity that they expect to be decreased by changes in mobility. So they want less cars, more bikes. You will see if you go into the city that in some streets, like there's one main artery going through the city, that they're already closing down street lanes. So that creates a lot of space in the middle of the city, which is very valuable. Then there's a very strong ecological ambition. So there are ambitions for creating ecological links within the city. And that requires a lot of small-scale design interventions. And of course, there's a large housing ambition, where quite a lot of new houses need to be included within the city of Rotterdam. And in total, in the Netherlands, they want to, checking the time, still okay. And in total in the Netherlands, there's an ambition to build 1 million new houses. So that's quite a bit. So the focus is really on urbanization as this kind of driving force within cities. Then it's also really effective to combine it with, for instance, renovations. We see a lot of upgrading in the public space. So projects that will already be ongoing. So here we see the kind of social housing objects. So all these buildings are owned by corporations. So if you want to do something in these neighborhoods, you can take them along and get funding from them. We see challenges in the transition from the heating system. So if you look where the big budgets are in the cities that you can connect with or can transition with, it's really those smaller assignments that you might not expect. But here we see this challenge to get a new heating system into the city that is not using gas as a source for heating anymore. And that means that for all these projects, the streets need to be open and redeveloped anyway. So that's a very powerful one. And there are a lot of public space projects ongoing. Then we have salinity. That is something that in Swiss you will not have to deal with that often, I think. But what we see is that Rotterdam is of course close to the sea. And with sea level rise, we see that the balance between water coming from the river and pushing out that saline water is disturbed when the water levels here go up. So what you see is that that saline water Both goes up in the rivers, also to the points where we let in our drinking water and fresh water supply, but also through the soil. So you see that this pressure from the sea really makes the salt water come up within the areas, and that means that a lot of vegetation that is not adapted for that has challenges, but also that ecology, the urban ecology, has a lot of challenges. Especially when it's a bit dry and hotter, we really see that the space that is there now for urban ecology, because we have some waterways, we have some canals, will really be insufficient. So there's a future challenge. And we see that green currently is designed in a way where we here see this little nice bump next to the station, but of course if you make a bump and you put your trees on it, they will have drought issues. So in summer we already see these tanks driving around to water the vegetation. We need to get a lot of extra green in, but that also means we need an extra amount of water. And currently the drink water suppliers raised alarm saying they will not have enough drinking water for our future urbanization challenge. So that if we build those 1 million houses, we will not be able to supply them with water, which is quite basic. So we really see for the first time we're reaching these limits where we thought we could do whatever and we just get the water there, we get the electricity there. And it's even at a stage that it's, for instance, with electricity, so difficult to have more electricity in the network that full factories are running on tanks of gasoline. So they just have tanks of gasoline they get from the harbor. They're functioning on that because they cannot be connected to the electricity network anymore. Then flood risk. You're probably aware of it, but the whole western side of the Netherlands is actually under sea level, protected by a lot of dikes and dunes. And what we see is that most of the areas are like 3 to 5 meters under sea level, so that if there's a flood, the city could flood up to 5 meters. So that's quite a bit, and everything above 50 centimeters, you'll get people that can die and really get fatalities, so you want to avoid that. That doesn't mean that it's a risky area. Oh. We have a very strong flood risk protection system, but what we see with sea level rise is that we might need to change that system in the long future. So if we look at these rivers now, they have this open connection to the sea, and we're now actually on this unbanked area where the city originated, so this is a bit higher. Behind it you will see that it goes down and it's lower. And to keep this protection, if the sea level rises a bit more, we might either have to strengthen these levees with about 2 to 3 meters at different places. Of course, the height depends a bit. So that's quite a bit urban challenge, but also we might get disconnected from the river. And here you see some photos of this challenge. This is a bit more upstream. So here we see those houses that are a bit older. And in that theory that the house is removed every 30 years, this is not a problem, but if this house remains there for 100 years, you see that that levee has to kind of go up and grow in between. And the challenges we're looking at, for instance, for this levee, the expectation is that with very mild sea level, this levee will need to be 1.2 meters higher, I think. And then they come to designers and they say, okay, we would like this levee to be 1.2 up to 2 meters higher. Could you design that? Just try to imagine how you would get it in. It's quite challenging. Then in the unbanked areas, we see that, of course, these higher river levels can also make sure that the area floods more frequent. So this is a map where we see the 1 in 1,000 year flooding. And that is, of course, like really beyond that lifespan of buildings. But the expectation is that if sea level rise continues, it might be that this 1 in 1,000 becomes a 1 in 100. That means that it's in that lifespan time, and that every 100 years, everything that is in this area could flood. And there's this huge building development in these former harbor areas, so I think this is a very interesting challenge. Like, how can you do that in a way it's flood-proof? We have some nice examples from, for instance, Hamburg Hafen City, an area that already currently floods more frequent, and there all the buildings are developed in a way that they have this safe entrance in case of a flooding, so they're prepared for increasing sea level rise. And that's now something they're also thinking of here. And I think as a design challenge, that's always quite interesting to work on. Like, how do you do that in a way that it can facilitate 2 meters of water without creating any challenges? How we're currently dealing with this. This is an island that is, I think you can see it from the other level in the river. So this is one of the bit older building areas. And here you see that if the water reaches about this limit, there's this big barrier, that side, that will be closed off so that the sea water levels cannot get in anymore, and this whole city area is protected from flooding. So that system works quite well, but what we do see is with sea level rise, that barrier would have to close more and more often. A while ago they made some calculations and it would have to close, I think, up to 17 times a year, and that was without extreme sea level rise. Well, we also have one of the biggest harbors. The harbor is really important economically. If that would really be closed off 17 times a year, it would become unreliable and have quite a big impact on our economy. And of course, Rotterdam is here. This open connection also really to the hinterland and the rest of Europe is one of the few open connections for ecology. So also cutting that off would have quite a big impact. One of the options is to say we'll keep the barrier open and we'll elevate all the city edges. This is a very old sketch, as you can see. And now they're thinking of new options for that, also with more ecological shores. You'll see that Rotterdam has a lot of hard edges, and they're now trying to kind of smoothen that up and bring more options in for tidal movements to really support ecology. So these tidal flats are one of the most important conditions for ecologies in this delta area. So they're trying to construct it even in the urban area, or reconstruct it, I should say. And this is an island that is a bit further on the river, where they're really trying to create this urban ecological park. And if you would not do it with an edge, you could do it with the buildings and flood-proofing these. So this is a bit further upstream, where they already decided to flood-proof all the buildings, so that the water can really get up against it. And this guy is closing the curtains to escape the photographers internationally that come when it's high water to photograph this. But the whole buildings are made flood-proof. This is an example again from Hamburg. So what they did here is they really created that area that can flood. And you also see that buildings even have double entrances, like upper entrances and lower entrances, so that in case of a flood, you can use the upper entrance to still have connectivity. Of course, it's really important to be able to adapt. And what we already see in Hamburg is that the water levels are rising a bit faster than they thought. So this designing on the water levels is a very nice concept, but if there are unexpected changes in the rise of the water, you do have a challenge because you cannot adapt this easily. Also, what you can develop depends a lot, of course, on the economic development. In the Netherlands, we really got used to be able to have a lot of investments, high economic growth. And what we see here is drawings that kind of show futuristic images of the city under different scenarios. So here it shows more moderate climate change. Up we see higher economic means, and then you see that the city could really kind of grow as it is into a sort of New York. If there's a lot of climate change, but you have a lot of investment, you have a lot of money to be able to adapt to it. But if you have severe climate change and your economic growth is limited, then you really have big challenges on how to adapt the city. And the interesting part is that also climate change can affect your investment. Because what we see, there are financial mechanisms that kind of control how much rent you pay if you have big loans as a country. And the Netherlands has this very high kind of rating in it. So if you borrow money to the Netherlands, it's very secure. Climate change can impact these ratings. So that are discussions that are going on now. Internationally, banks are starting to look more at these ratings, and that could mean that your investment potential will go down while you need to adapt a lot. And that is also why that early adaptation is so important, because it could be that at the time you need to adapt, you're not able to anymore. Then there's heat. I think heat in the Netherlands is still a bit underestimated if you compare it to other countries. We still see that in old neighborhoods, the first thing people do if they purchase a house is cut out the 100-year-old trees to have a bit more sun in the garden. But we really see this becoming a challenge. Here we see the areas in the city with a perceived temperature, and we see that in a lot of areas it goes over 44 on hotter days. And we really see that in the old neighborhoods, but also in the company terrains. So there's a big challenge. And this is one of the things they're starting to address. Of course, it's also bringing in a lot of green into the city, so making sure the city doesn't heat up that much. And currently they're really trying to prevent that moment where you will become an air conditioning based city, because the air conditioning has a lot of environmental disadvantages, but also heats up the public space again. So you want to be in that spot where you can keep the city and the buildings cool in a way that prevents needing to go to air conditioning. This is more about data. I see the map is a bit unsharp. With these maps, it's always important, and I think as a designer, with every data map you get, to really ask, what do you see? So for instance, here we see a new the vegetation didn't grow. So I think always as designers working with data, be critical on the data and try to see why is this popping up in the map or not. And this is an example that I took from Singapore, a social housing example. And what you see there is that it's a very logic to in every building include, for instance, natural ventilation. Here's something went wrong. Here it's okay again. So this natural ventilation is very important to equip for, but it's also challenging in an urban environment where you have a lot of noise, you have a lot of people on the street, so that really requires something from the designer to prevent that air conditioning. And it's also about making sure that if you have these areas with very limited cool spaces, you really try to cool spaces up. So sometimes we see squares like these that are in the middle of an area with insufficient cool public spaces, and it's very easy to transform as long as you start growing trees on time, because a mature tree is crazy expensive. It's tens of thousands of euros to get it. A young tree is much cheaper. So this is really a strategy you should start now to in 20, 30 years have sufficient cool spaces. And otherwise it's difficult to afford it with vegetation. And here the city developed a whole toolbox, and they made maps where you can really see what are the existing public spaces and where there's still the potential to increase the amount of cool spaces within the city. So that can be very useful to work with. And of course, how to cool it, there can be a lot of design examples and local interventions. The last thing I wanted to get at is the harbor and its challenges. Of course, it has all the climate challenges as well. but also it has this whole more circular economy challenge, and the harbor is an important motor for a city. And this is where the goods that arrive at our harbor go to, and we do see that it's still based on this quite traditional business model on getting in a lot of containers, getting in a lot of oil and transferring it to Eastern Europe. And there are very low margins on it, sometimes just a few cents. So it's really this having a lot of bulk and then very cheaply transporting it. Well, if you look at all the circularity principles, that's everything circularity is not about. So that means that the city, but also the harbor, have a very big challenge in that. And what you see is, if you look at what's being transported, there are always like different categories that can travel by different modalities. So there's some pipelines, they're solely for oils. They're now looking whether you can also use it for nitrogen. There's a railway. They try to do as much as possible by rail. But here, if we see the volumes from rail, truck and water, this truck is still the majority. And that is simply because not everything can easily go into ships or trains because it's not in containers. So this transport and the congestion is also one of the challenges I think almost every city faces currently. And if you want to tackle that, it's a lot in seeing what kind of goods are being transported by what modality. And we see that actually on the road, the oil is relatively limited, so we'll see some changes, but not automatically. So one of the big challenges there is also not just the goods that come in, but also the discharge of building materials, waste, and how to recycle that and use that as well as possible. And of course, for that you would like to have more local flows, and that would mean that the harbor will get much more important connection to local hubs in the area, but also that a lot of space will be needed for that. So here, well, we twisted the river of Rotterdam. We see Rotterdam connected to Delft and The Hague. We see a lot of company terrains alongside it that are being transformed. So you will see that that second layer in the harbor, so not just the big harbor going to Germany, but all the local connections will become much more important. But of course, also their choices have to be made between shipping materials, ecology, recreation, how do you want to use the water. And that means that in cities, if you become more circular, you'll also need much more space for materials. And of course, in the harbor, this climate adaptation is also a very challenging one. And here they're like with the city, exploring different options for where can I keep the water out and where should I really adapt to it. So I think in the whole flood story, it's always this kind of game of what do you do on a regional level, what do you do locally, where do you keep it out, and where do you adapt. And that's it for now.